Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's meeting of the Income Generation Subcommittee. I think we can go straight away into the agenda, looking for any appointment of substitutes at all.
Chair, we don't have any substitutes this evening. Councillor Chris Mitchell has sent us apologies, so we'll record those in the minutes.
All right, thank you. And item 2, any declarations of interest from anyone?
No.
No, there are none. Okay. I take it by the empty seats at the back there's no public participation?
None.
Thank you. And then finally, in relation to to the minutes, agenda item 4, everybody happy for them to be signed up? Have you had the opportunity of reading them through? Yeah, thank you. I'll get those signed then. Okay, we go to the first real main agenda item, which is the proposed committee performance scorecard for 22-23. And I think, Mark, you're presenting?
Yes, thank you, Chair. As you'll be aware, the committee receives the quarterly update on the scorecard, and this is the proposed scorecard for the new coming year. The format and content is the same as has been in place for the current year, with the income targets reset in line with the budget that was approved at Council a couple of weeks ago. Those targets reflect either an increase in line with inflation, or where the particular income stream has shown growth over the last 12 months, then the increase is obviously higher. A good example of that is garden waste, for instance. Conversely, the car park income, which is far and away the council's biggest income stream, shows no increase because there has been no increase in the individual parking charges. The line in the middle, property investment income, shows a substantial increase, and that's because we've changed the approach. The target for last year related specifically to the investments acquired as part of the council's development fund, but with that now brought to a close because of the government's restrictions on councils acquiring property solely for income purposes. We've realigned it to represent the income from all the council's property investments, which includes those that were held previously, particularly the industrial units across the city. As new investments are acquired as part of the Future High Streets Fund or the Towns Fund, then we will include those as time progresses. And as it notes at the bottom, there have been no new additions in terms of the PIs. I think that's all I've got to say, Chair. If anybody's got any questions, happy to take.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. We're asked to consider the report. Any questions in relation to this from anyone? I think it looks like that we've considered it, and thank you very much indeed. So that one goes through. We go to agenda item number 6, which relates to the football facilities at Purdeswell. Shane.
Thank you, Chair. It's quite a long journey this. We've been looking at the football facilities at Purdeswell for a couple of years now. There were a number of delays in the process, partly caused by COVID and the interruption there, but also partly because of the development of other priorities. And in the first instance, we were working our way through the process of working with the football club around their move to claims and so on. So there are a number of things which have brought us to this point. At the last committee, or the last but one, we recognised that if we're going to sort of bring these to a conclusion, we need to update the costings and think about, are they still viable? They were done some years ago now, a couple of years back. So I asked the consultants who did the previous work to revisit those and try to understand whether or not they are still viable, whether they still make sense as projects to do. That work concentrated primarily on the numbers in terms of whether they're financially viable. So there are wider considerations as to whether or not these are the right things to do. But one thing that we do need to do at this stage is to kind of separate them out. They've been very closely related together, partly because the original work focused on having one changing facility which would support both facilities, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the way that it's done. There are other ways of dealing with that. That sort of drew the two together, and it was part of an overall programme of improving football facilities in the area. What's proposed now then is the all-weather pitch potentially to go forward, and we've been in discussion with one of the local schools about proposals which they have, and we want to try and work in a way which helps to support this delivery, which is in the best interests of everyone concerned. So we have undertaken this extra financial analysis, and it remains viable as it was before as a standalone proposal, but it is dependent upon a grant from the Football Foundation. So there is and one of the conditions of that is that income generated from the scheme goes back into continuing the life of the scheme. Therefore, it doesn't generate income or surplus for the council, which can be used to support other activities. So it remains viable, but is best considered then within the overall considerations around sports development, which falls to the Communities Committee. So I'm suggesting in the report that from now on, that's taken forward as part of that rather than being considered as an income generation item. With respect to futsal, that too remains viable if you look at the way that the costs have changed and the potential income has changed. But one thing that has not been taken into account there is the costs that would be incurred now if we were to close the 2 5-a-side pitches that we already have, because we've agreed to develop those, and while we've agreed a way of moving up, if we want to take them back, that's doable. We've got a legal agreement to do that, but it would mean a compensating payment to Freedom Leisure to do that. So that particular bit hasn't been considered here, and that might be a factor. One of the other things that we talked about at a previous meeting was, rather than futsal, what's the option of having simply more 5-a-side pitches against the leisure centre? Would that be a better use of the funds? I didn't ask the consultants to look at that in particular. This stage was just to say whether the futsal facility was still viable. So the answer to that question is yes. Is it the right thing to do is a different matter, and I think therefore we need to explore that in more detail and look to say whether or not we want to go down the futsal route, or whether we want to go for more 5-a-side pitches and look to generate income from those. The ones that have been refurbished, they're open, aren't they? And they're running well. Yes, they are running well. And they are, I think we're having regular meetings with Freedom Leisure about income and costs, and I've seen from that they are generating income, so they are effective. So we've got information about income levels that more 5-a-side pitches would generate, and therefore we should be able to come to a decision on that quite quickly, but we do need to do some extra work. So for the time being, the proposal is that we ask the Communities Committee to go forward with the all-weather pitch proposal, and then we do some further consideration around 5-a-side or futsal and reach a decision on that, in which direction we want to go. Any questions? I'm happy to open it out for a discussion.
All right, thank you, Shane. Appreciate in the document it talks about the appendix, which is an exempt item, but I'm thinking that everybody's had the opportunity of looking at that and reading that. So it may well be that any questions now could relate purely to this report, and we can possibly make a decision as it stands without going into an exempt situation on this particular item, unless anybody's got any thoughts about that differ. Okay. Any questions for Shane, please?
Is it working? Yeah, thank you. We talk about it as a sort of futsal facility, but clearly it would be multi-use, multi-purpose. And at previous committee we discussed, or certainly I raised the fact that, you know, to have organised team sports, it tends to be a evening and weekend in order to be able to get, you know, large groups of people together. But there would be hopefully an opportunity to be using it throughout the day for sports and activities that don't require the organisation of large teams. For example, badminton and I can't remember. There's another sort of hand tennis and other other activities. Was that taken into account by the study in terms of income from throughout the day from a variety of different activities, as well as potential hosting events and so on, like the current sports hall also does?
Through you, Chair, it was acknowledged that it could be used for other things, and some allowance was made for that. The income, though, was primarily for the futsal use. It was considered primarily for that. So it's possible that it might generate more income than we've taken into account. So that's one of the factors we'd have to look at. The substantive point about it, of course, is it's a covered arena as opposed to the five-a-side pitches, which will be open and subject to weather conditions and all the rest of it, which means it's a bit more flexible as a facility, not just for football. It could be used for a variety of things. So that is one of the things to take into account in the decision as to which is the best way to go with the facility to make the best use of the land there.
Yeah, on the five-a-side football pitches, I mean, I thought that bringing them back into use or updating them was like an interim measure, but it seems to have now sort of created a alternative option and sort of muddied the water a bit from what was looking at a futsal stadium. Now it seems to have opened up other avenues. Now, in my thoughts were it was really just to bring the pitches into use while the debate and decision making and was sort of ongoing, rather than it now becoming a completely alternative option.
Yes, I think it was originally designed as a part of the COVID recovery work, actually, in terms of the trying to get Freedom Leisure's income levels back up again. One of the things which made futsal as an attractive option, or the arena as an attractive option, was the fact that the pitches were there and they were falling into disuse. And this was, well, do we refurbish them? Do we invest in that, or do we look to do something different and take the opportunity to build this facility? And one of the things which went into the consideration around that was the fact that the refurbishment didn't cost us anything. That was done using Freedom Leisure's reserves. So it was an opportunity that gave us the chance to start to generate more income, but it meant a commitment in terms of Freedom going into and doing the investment there. So we built into that the opportunity to pull them back, but we would need to recognise that they'd invested in the facility. So yes, you're right. It's muddied the pitch, if I can use that phrase. It's made it slightly different considerations than before. But the facility to bring them back, the opportunity to bring them back into use so that we can develop at the site remains. It's just changed the cost picture.
Thank you, Shane. Yeah, Joe.
Just a point of clarification, I think we need to be clear why this is going to the Communities Committee. So in terms of, it's not an income generation opportunity for us. So if you can make that clear for us, Chair. I mean, the other thing about this is in terms of the actual footprint of this on Purdyswell land. I mean, the irony is obviously a few years back there was a football club application on this very site, or quite close to it, and in terms of the amount of space, slightly, admittedly, probably more, but in terms of the increase in usage that we anticipate with developing this, that would have accounted for the amount of increase in usage of the football pitch. So I think we need to be clear here that if Purdyswell is to be a site for a football, that we were in a bit of a difficult situation in terms of the football the football club originally going on there. So I think that needs to be sorted out. We're developing a site now, which is probably 6 or 7 pitches, possibly in that. In terms of the actual footprint, it's going to add the amount of pressure that's going to add on for the parking and the amount of visitors. It's going to be constant use rather than from a football. So I think, the irony needs to be seen by the council in terms of what we're considering here and what was being proposed. Or admittedly, it's slightly different, but in terms of usage and in terms of footprint space, it's I can't but see that that issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I would just say that I think you're right insofar as there has to be some sort of, not necessarily agreement, but an understanding of the amount of influx into the locality that will be taken up by extra players, visitors, and family. Come to that. So I suspect that will be taken into account as and while the initiative progresses. But as you say, we're going to need to, or the communities are going to need to keep an eye on exactly what the provisions are for people that are using the site. I mean, do we get any confirmation of that, Shane?
Through you, Chair. Yes, I mean, the original studies did look at the transport and parking and all of those issues. What was the conclusion largely that was reached was that futsal would not take up any more than a swimming gala would. So that if when the Purdeswell is used for swimming galas and those operate and there's sufficient parking to cover those and the number of spectators was understood to be around about the same, if we were to go down the five-side pitch option, then that would be a different profile, wouldn't it? A different level of use, possibly a smaller number of users and very, very unlikely to be spectators. And whereas futsal could potentially hold tournaments and so on where there'd be spectators as well. So it'd be a different usage profile, and certainly that would have to be taken into account. In respect to the first question, yes, my argument here is that the all-weather pitch wouldn't be something that generates income for the council in a general sense. So it now falls more within the development of the Communities Committee, which is responsible. Its remit covers sports and leisure. So that's why I'm suggesting that we take it there rather than continue to look at it here. But that's just the all-weather pitch element. The other bit is an income generation investment, so therefore we would look at it.
Yeah, thank you. And don't think for 1 second that I don't support Worcester to be a premier destination for sport. What I'm trying to say is if we want to do it, let's do it properly. And you know, the sums that we're talking about, if we do go for that option, and the various committees decide 3.2, 3.3, they're not insignificant sums of money, which you know, in effect, would have built a stadium for a football pitch twice over and got that for association. But you know, quite happy to support your decision, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. I think perhaps that's why we're a subcommittee of the PNR as opposed to anything else. But I would say I have had a conversation with the chair of communities, and there's an agreement there that that can go forward. So just to make it clear, the recommendation is that the subcommittee notes updated cost models for futsal and pitch developments at Purdeswell and agree to receive a further report on the creation of a new five-a-side pitches adjacent to the Purdeswell Leisure Centre. Are we happy with that closure? Yes? Agreed? Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes.
I'm not 100% happy about the five-side pitches and now, you know, what the decision that was made as a relatively minor decision is now forming part of the formal recommendation, I think. But I'll go with the majority.
Through you, Chair, if it helps slightly on that, I mean, the compensation payments work on the basis of a sliding scale. So if it would take us a little while to get to the point where we can develop the site, then the compensation payment period might well have finished, in which case they will have no bearing on the cost. So that might help.
Sorry, because we're separating out the 3D pitch, which obviously is quite a large space. I mean, and that's going to go to a separate committee. I mean, that potentially leaves us making a decision on a futsal stadium, or maybe it could have a more generic title because it could be multi-use, and a grass pitch. Is that correct? Or was the grass pitch going as well with the 3G pitch?
Through you, Chair, yeah, the grass pitch is part of the overall development of Purdeswell Soccer Hub. So that forms part of the all-weather pitch, the grass pitch development. So the futsal stadium, which is another part on the back side of the leisure centre, is a separate development to that.
Okay, thank you.
come to agenda item 7, which is any other business, which is anybody having any business of sufficient urgency as to warrant consideration for this evening? If not, then we move to agenda item 8, which is items involving the disclosure of exempt information. So can I have a proposer, please, that we move to that? Thank you. And a seconder?